I returned home after 10 years. What I uncovered will shock you, but I made him answer for everything, and I stepped off the bus as the chilled night air wrapped around me. Willow Creek looked different than when I left, yet the ghosts of the past still lingered. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and for a moment, I felt like a stranger in my own hometown. It had been nearly a decade since I ran, leaving behind everything, everyone. But I had no choice back then. At least, that's what I told myself. The bus rumbled away behind me, leaving only silence. I gripped the handle of my worn-out suitcase, the only thing I had left after all these years, and started walking. The streets were familiar but carried an eerie stillness. Most of the stores had changed. Some were gone entirely. A neon sign flickered above a rundown diner at the corner, and my stomach twisted. That place used to be packed with laughter, cigarette smoke, and the scent of cheap coffee. Now, it looked like a shell of what it once was. I kept my head down, ignoring the whispers of the past clawing at my thoughts. I knew coming back would stir things up, but I didn't expect the town itself to feel haunted. Maybe it wasn't the town. Maybe it was me. The motel sat on the edge of town, looking just as miserable as I remembered. A single buzzing street lamp cast a dim light over the parking lot. I stepped inside, and the scent of stale air and cleaning chemicals filled my nose. The woman at the front desk barely glanced up as I slid cash across the counter. No ID, no questions. Just the way I wanted it. Room 12. The key felt heavy in my hand as I walked down the narrow hallway. The lock stuck for a moment before clicking open, revealing a small, musty room with peeling wallpaper and an old TV that probably hadn't worked in years. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, exhaling. I was back. The next morning, I walked to the old diner, half expecting to find it abandoned. Instead, the moment I stepped inside, a heavy silence fell over the place. Conversations halted, and heads turned. I knew that reaction well. Small towns never forget, and Willow Creek had always loved its rumors. A woman behind the counter froze, coffee pot in hand. Eleanor. She hadn't changed much, still had that sharp gaze that could see straight through you. She hesitated before finally pouring a cup and setting it down in front of me without a word. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, staring at the dark liquid as if it held answers. The whispers started up again, hushed voices just loud enough to remind me that I didn't belong here anymore. A chair scraped against the floor, and I tensed as someone slid into the seat across from me. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. Mason. His voice was the same, steady, controlled, but with an edge. Didn't think I'd ever see you again. I finally met his gaze. He looked older, more tired. Back then, he had been my best friend, the one person who tried to stop me from leaving. Now, there was something unreadable in his eyes. I wasn't planning on coming back, I admitted. Then why are you here? I hesitated, gripping the coffee cup tighter. How could I explain it? That the past never really let go? That I couldn't keep running from it? Before I could answer, Eleanor finally spoke. Some people won't be happy to see you here, Natalie. I glanced at her. Are you? She sighed, wiping her hands on a rag before looking at me like a mother scolding a reckless child. I don't know yet. The door chimed as another customer walked in, and Eleanor turned away, conversation over. Mason leaned back in his seat, watching me closely. You should be careful, he said after a moment. I let out a dry laugh. What else is new? Mason didn't smile. He just shook his head, pushing back his chair as he stood. Just don't go digging where you shouldn't. He left without another word, and I was left staring into my coffee, the weight of his warning pressing down on me. Later that afternoon, I walked the familiar path to my old house. I already knew what I would find, but seeing it in person was something else. It was worse than I remembered. The windows were shattered, the front door barely hanging on its hinges. The fire had left its mark, blackened walls, collapsed roof, the bones of my childhood home standing like a burned-out skeleton. No one had bothered to fix it. No one had wanted to. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath my feet. Memories flooded back, the laughter, the fights, the night everything went up in flames. I swallowed hard and turned away, but as I did, I felt it again. Someone was watching me. I didn't see anyone. The street was empty. The trees stood still, unmoving in the cold air. But the feeling wouldn't leave. A chill ran down my spine, and I forced myself to keep walking, my pulse quickening with every step. I wasn't imagining it. Someone knew I was back, and they weren't happy about it. I left my old house with a heavy feeling in my chest. The past clung to me like smoke, refusing to fade. The streets felt colder, emptier. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I walked back toward town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows between the buildings seemed darker, stretching too far. I turned corners quickly, glanced over my shoulder more times than I could count, but saw nothing. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it wasn't. Mason found me before I could reach the motel. He stepped in front of me, hands in his jacket pockets, blocking my way. "You shouldn't be here, Nat." I got that message loud and clear. I tried to move past him, but he didn't budge. "I'm serious. Some people don't want you back." His voice was quieter this time, almost like he was trying to warn me. I folded my arms, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. "Are you one of them?" His jaw tensed. "No, but that doesn't mean I can protect you." I scoffed. "Didn't ask you to." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Then do yourself a favor and leave before it's too late." I walked around him, my heart pounding. If Mason was telling me to go, then I was definitely getting close to something someone didn't want me to find. But I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Instead of heading back to the motel, I changed course. There was one person I knew would have answers: Liam. He had been my brother's best friend once, almost like a second brother to me. If anyone still remembered the truth, it was him. His auto shop sat on the outskirts of town, a small, run-down building with a flickering sign that barely held on to the last few letters of his name. The garage door was open, and I spotted him under the hood of a car, grease covering his hands. I stopped just outside. "Liam." He stilled for a second before slowly looking up. His eyes darkened the moment he saw me. "Well, I'll be damned." He grabbed a rag, wiping his hands, his expression unreadable. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." "Yeah, I'm getting that a lot." He nodded toward the office. "Come inside." The small room smelled of oil and old coffee. He sat on the edge of the desk, arms crossed. "Why'd you come back?" I hesitated. "I need to know what really happened to Caleb." His whole body stiffened at the name. I pressed on. "They said it was an accident, but you and I both know that's not true." Liam exhaled slowly, rubbing his face. "You should let this go, Natalie. Tell me the truth." For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, finally, he sighed. Caleb was looking into something before he died. He was asking questions, digging too deep, and then, suddenly, he was gone. I swallowed hard. Digging into what? Liam hesitated before walking over to an old filing cabinet. He pulled out a small, worn notebook and handed it to me. This was his. I flipped through the pages. Names, dates, scribbled notes in a handwriting I knew too well. My hands shook as I read over them. He was investigating someone? Liam nodded. "The mayor. Richard. Your brother thought he was stealing money from the town, covering things up. And then, one night, Caleb ends up dead." The cops didn't ask too many questions. I gripped the notebook tighter. The pieces started falling into place, and my stomach twisted. This wasn't just a tragedy. This was murder. Liam's voice was low. "Whoever did this, they're still here, Natalie. And they don't like people asking questions." I left his shop with my mind spinning. Caleb hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had found something worth killing for. And now, I was walking down the same path. That night, I barely slept. I kept the notebook under my pillow, my fingers tracing the ink on the pages as if Caleb's words could tell me what to do next. The motel room felt suffocating, the silence too loud. I left the TV on just for background noise, but it didn't help. Sometime around 3 in the morning, a sound made my blood run cold. A soft click. I sat up, my breath frozen in my throat. The door. Slowly, I reached for my phone, my fingers barely brushing it before I noticed something on the pillow next to me. A Polaroid photo. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was of me and Caleb, taken years ago. We were smiling, arms wrapped around each other. But it wasn't the photo itself that made my skin crawl. It was the words scrawled on the back. Leave before you end up like him. My pulse pounded as I shot out of bed, flipping on the lights. The door was still locked. The windows still shut. But someone had been here. Someone had been close enough to leave this. I grabbed my suitcase, shoved my things inside, and paced the room, my mind racing. Leaving would be the smart thing to do. Walking away would keep me safe. But Caleb hadn't walked away. He had tried to find the truth, and it had cost him everything. I wasn't going to let that happen again. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Morning came too soon, but I was already awake, staring at the ceiling as the motel room filled with pale light. The Polaroid was still clutched in my hand. The words on the back burned into my mind. Someone wanted me gone. Someone had been in this room, close enough to leave a message without waking me. I sat up, rubbing my face. Fear curled in my stomach, but underneath it, something stronger stirred, anger. I grabbed Caleb's notebook and flipped through the pages again. His notes were messy but detailed. He had listed names, businesses, numbers that didn't make sense at first glance. But one word kept appearing over and over again. Pier 17. Willow Creek wasn't exactly a city with a bustling port. The river that ran along the outskirts had a handful of abandoned docks, mostly used for storage. But why had Caleb been so focused on one specific pier? I needed answers. After checking out of the motel, I made my way to the police station. If anyone had information, it would be Lucas. He had been a friend of my father's once, back before everything fell apart. I hadn't seen him since I was a teenager, but if there was even a chance he could tell me something, I had to take it. The station smelled of stale coffee and old paper. A few officers gave me wary looks as I approached the front desk. Before I could say anything, a familiar voice spoke from behind me. I was wondering when you'd show up. I turned to see Lucas standing in the doorway of his office, arms crossed. He looked older, more worn down, but his sharp eyes hadn't changed. Come on in, he said, leading the way. His office was cluttered, stacks of files piled on his desk, but it felt safe, like an island in the middle of a storm. He motioned for me to sit, then leaned back in his chair, studying me. You shouldn't have come back, Natalie. I exhaled. Yeah, I've been hearing that a lot. He nodded toward the notebook in my hands. Caleb's. I hesitated, then handed it to him. He was looking into something before he died. I need to know what he found. Lucas flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Your brother was a good kid, stubborn, but smart. He knew something was wrong in this town, and he was determined to prove it. He glanced up at me. But that kind of truth gets people killed. I swallowed hard. Do you think he was murdered? Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out an old police file, sliding it across the desk. I opened it, my stomach twisting. Caleb's case. The official report. Cause of death. Accidental drowning. My hands clenched into fists. That's a lie. Lucas nodded. I always thought so too. But there was no evidence to prove otherwise. And the people who could have helped, he shook his head. They kept their mouths shut. I flipped through the pages. One detail stood out. His body was found near the river, close to Pier 17. Lucas sighed. That place was trouble back then. Still is. Your brother went poking around, and it cost him his life. I met his gaze. Then I need to go there. His jaw tightened. No, you don't. I have to. He stared at me for a long moment before finally speaking. Then be careful. And don't trust anyone too easily. I left the station with my pulse racing. The truth was close. I could feel it. By the time I reached Pier 17, the sun was sinking, casting long shadows over the rusted shipping containers and abandoned warehouses. The air smelled of damp wood and river water, and the silence was unsettling. I climbed over the rusted gate and moved carefully between the stacks of crates. Caleb had come here before he died. He had found something worth killing for. A sudden noise made me freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone was here. I pressed myself against a crate, heart pounding. A shadow moved in the distance. A figure in a dark jacket, scanning the area. My breath caught. Mason. What the hell was he doing here? I stayed hidden, watching as he moved toward one of the warehouses. He unlocked the door and slipped inside. I waited a few minutes before following. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit space filled with old shipping records, discarded crates, and dust-covered equipment. Mason was standing near a metal cabinet, flipping through files. He hadn't seen me yet. I took a step forward. Looking for something? He tensed, spinning around. His expression darkened. "Damn it, Natalie. You knew Caleb was murdered," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "And you never said a word." Mason's jaw tightened. "You don't understand. Then explain it to me." For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something real. But then he shook his head. "You need to leave. Now." I took a step closer. "Not until you tell me the truth." A sound outside made both of us freeze. Mason cursed under his breath. Too late. Before I could react, the door burst open, and two men stepped inside. One of them I recognized instantly, Mayor Richard. The other was a man I didn't know, but he had the kind of face that made my stomach twist. The kind of man who didn't hesitate to get his hands dirty. Well, Richard said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I was wondering when you'd start causing real problems." Mason moved slightly in front of me. "She was just leaving." Richard smirked. "No, I don't think she was." The other man stepped forward, and I instinctively backed up. Mason tensed. "Let her go, Richard. She doesn't know anything." Richard tilted his head. "Oh, I think she knows enough." His gaze shifted to me. "Your brother was just as nosy as you. Look where that got him." White-hot rage filled my chest. "You killed him." He sighed. "No, but I made sure the right people took care of the problem." My hands clenched. "You're stealing from this town." Richard chuckled. "Please. It's not stealing when no one notices." I felt Mason shift beside me. His muscles were tense, like he was preparing for something. Richard's smirk faded. "I'll give you one chance, Natalie. Walk away. Forget all of this." I met his gaze. "Not a chance." His sigh was almost disappointed. "Shame." Then everything happened at once. The other man lunged toward me, but Mason moved first, knocking him back. I took the chance to run, sprinting for the door. Mason was right behind me. "Go." We burst into the night, my heart hammering. I didn't stop running until we were far from the pier, my lungs burning. I turned to Mason, breathless. "Are you with them or not?" He looked at me, torn between something. "I'm with you." For the first time, I wasn't sure if I believed him. The cold air burned my lungs as I ran. My feet pounded against the pavement, Mason right beside me, but my mind was spinning too fast to process anything beyond survival. Richard had just admitted to covering up Caleb's murder. He had warned me to walk away, but I had done the opposite. Now, I was officially a problem. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town. My legs felt like they were on fire, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but I refused to slow down. The motel was out of the question. Richard knew where I was staying. He had people watching me. Mason grabbed my arm, pulling me into a narrow alley between two buildings. His grip was firm but not rough, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he caught his breath. He was staring at me, his eyes sharp, calculating. "You should have left when you had the chance," he muttered. I wrenched my arm away. "And let them get away with it?" "No." Mason ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "You don't understand what you're up against, Natalie. These people don't just scare you into leaving. They eliminate problems." I stepped closer, my voice low but steady. "Then why are you here? If you're so convinced I should leave, why did you help me back there?" His jaw tightened. He looked away, but that hesitation was all the confirmation I needed. Mason wasn't fully on their side. "Not yet. I need to get into the storage unit," I said. His head snapped back toward me. "What?" I held up Caleb's notebook. He left a key. I found it in the remains of our house. Whatever he discovered, whatever got him killed, it has to be there. Mason exhaled sharply. "That's suicide. Then why don't you stop me?" Silence stretched between us. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He could have walked away. He could have turned me in. Instead, he sighed. Where is it? Relief mixed with suspicion. You're helping me now? Let's just say I don't want to add your name to the list of people Richard's gotten rid of, he muttered. I didn't trust him. Not fully. But right now, I didn't have a choice. The storage facility was on the outskirts of town, tucked behind an abandoned shopping plaza. We waited until after dark before making our move, slipping through the rusted gate and staying close to the shadows. The place was mostly deserted, the security camera hanging loose from its mount, long since broken. I found the unit easily, number 406. My hands trembled as I slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, the metal door groaning as it rolled up. The smell of dust and old paper hit me immediately. Inside, there were stacks of file boxes, a few old duffel bags, and a metal cabinet shoved into the corner. I reached for the nearest box, my fingers brushing against the edge when Mason grabbed my wrist. Wait. I froze. He scanned the small space, then crouched down, running his fingers along the floor. He cursed under his breath. Tripwire, he muttered. My stomach dropped. If you had stepped forward without looking, this whole place would have gone up in flames, Mason said, his voice grim. They were expecting you. I swallowed hard. Mason carefully traced the wire to a small, crude device attached to the wall. He exhaled sharply. It's amateur work, but effective enough. Someone wanted to make sure if you ever came here, you wouldn't leave alive. My fingers clenched around Caleb's notebook. He had hidden something in here. Something dangerous enough that they were still trying to bury it, even after all these years. Mason pulled a knife from his pocket and carefully cut the wire. The tension in my chest eased slightly, but the fear didn't leave. I stepped over the Naughty Fuse trap and grabbed one of the file boxes, flipping open the lid. My breath caught. Inside were stacks of documents, bank statements, invoices, handwritten notes. Mason looked over my shoulder. What the hell is this? I pulled out a folder, my hands shaking as I skimmed the pages. The names on the documents were familiar. Local businesses, politicians, even the police department. Caleb had been right. Richard had been siphoning money from the town, covering it up with fake transactions, rerouting funds through dummy corporations. But that wasn't the worst part. I flipped to another page and felt my blood turn to ice. A list of names. Some had been crossed out. Mason looked over my shoulder, and I heard the sharp intake of his breath. This is a kill list, he muttered. And Caleb's name was on it. I stared at the document, my hands tightening around the paper. My brother had found this before he died. He had known too much, and they had silenced him. And now, my name was next. A sound outside made me snap my head up. Footsteps. Mason grabbed my arm, shoving me behind the metal cabinet as the door to the unit rolled open. I held my breath as heavy boots stepped inside. She was supposed to be here by now, a voice muttered. Check the files. Make sure nothing's missing, another said. Mason pressed a hand against my shoulder, silently telling me to stay still. I watched as two men stepped inside, both armed. They scanned the unit, one of them flipping open the box we had just been looking through. My pulse pounded. If they saw the missing document in my hands, we were dead. One of them turned toward the cabinet, his eyes narrowing. Mason moved before I could stop him. He lunged forward, grabbing a rusted metal pipe from the floor and swinging it hard. It connected with the first man's ribs, sending him staggering. The second man reached for his gun. I didn't think. I acted. I grabbed the heaviest box I could find and slammed it into his head. He stumbled, cursing, and Mason knocked him out cold with another swing. Breathing heavily, I stared down at the two unconscious men. Mason grabbed my wrist. We have to go. Now. I didn't argue. I shoved the files into my bag and bolted out of the unit. We ran through the lot, disappearing into the night. We didn't stop until we reached Liam's auto shop. He took one look at us and swore. What the hell did you two do? I dumped the documents onto the table. We found the truth. Liam's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. This is enough to bury Richard and everyone working with him. Mason ran a hand through his hair. Then why do I have a feeling we're not going to make it out of this alive? I met his gaze, my chest tightening. Because they won't go down without a fight. And I knew, deep down, the worst was yet to come. The night stretched long and heavy, pressing in around us like a suffocating weight. The documents lay scattered across Liam's workbench, the truth written in ink and blood. Caleb had died for this. He had pieced it all together, uncovered the corruption rotting this town from the inside out. And now, I had proof. But proof meant nothing if I didn't live long enough to use it. Liam paced, his hands resting on the back of his neck, tension radiating from his every movement. Mason stood by the door, eyes darting toward the window every few seconds, checking for threats. I stayed by the table, flipping through the files again, making sure I hadn't missed anything. "We need to get this to someone who can actually do something with it," Liam said. "Someone outside of Willow Creek. If we go to the local police, they'll bury it before it sees the light of day." I looked up. "Lucas." Mason's expression darkened. "You sure we can trust him?" I hesitated. Lucas had warned me, given me pieces of the truth when no one else would. But he had also spent years in the same system that protected Richard. I didn't know where his true loyalty lay. "We don't have a choice," I said. Mason exhaled sharply but nodded. Liam grabbed the files and shoved them into an old duffel bag. "Then let's move. The longer we wait, the more likely they'll find us first." We slipped out the back door, sticking to the shadows. The streets were eerily silent, but I knew better than to think we were alone. I could feel eyes on me, the same crawling sensation I'd felt since the day I arrived. The town was watching, waiting. The police station was only a few blocks away, but every step felt like walking deeper into enemy territory. My heartbeat was a drum against my ribs, my breath shallow. Mason walked slightly ahead, his hand hovering near his waistband where I knew he had a knife hidden. Liam stuck close to me, gripping the strap of the duffel bag like it was the only thing keeping him steady. We were halfway there when the first shot rang out. The bullet hit the pavement near my feet, kicking up dust and debris. Instinct took over. I dove behind the nearest parked car, Liam right beside me. Mason ducked behind a dumpster, scanning the rooftops. "Sniper," he hissed. They knew we were coming. My pulse pounded. We were trapped. If we ran, they'd pick us off one by one. If we stayed, we were sitting ducks. Liam reached into his jacket, pulling out a small revolver. "We need to move. Fast." I nodded, gripping the strap of the duffel bag. "Cover me." Mason let out a low curse but didn't argue. He pulled a knife from his belt, his muscles tensed. Liam peeked around the car, spotted an opening, and fired 2 quick shots toward the rooftops. The distraction was enough. I sprinted toward the next alleyway, my feet barely touching the ground. Mason and Liam followed, staying low, zigzagging to make themselves harder targets. Another shot rang out, shattering the window of a parked truck, but we didn't stop. We reached the alley and ducked behind a row of dumpsters. My breath came in quick, ragged gasps. Mason pressed his back against the brick wall, his expression unreadable. "They're not going to stop," he said. "Richard won't let this get out." I looked down at the duffel bag, my hands shaking. "Then we make sure it does." Liam wiped sweat from his brow. "We need a car." Mason nodded. "I can get us one, but we'll need to split up. They're expecting us to stay together." It was a risk, but at this point, everything was. Mason disappeared into the shadows while Liam and I stayed low, cutting through side streets until we reached the back entrance of the police station. I knocked once, twice. A long pause, then the door creaked open. Lucas stood in the doorway, his expression tense. His eyes flicked to the bag in my hands, then back to my face. "You sure about this?" I met his gaze. "Caleb died for this. I won't let it be for nothing." He stepped aside, letting us in. The station was quiet, most of the officers gone for the night. Lucas locked the door behind us, leading us into his office. Liam dropped the bag on the desk, unzipping it. "Everything's here. Bank statements, transaction records, even a hit list." Lucas's face hardened as he flipped through the pages. "This is enough to bury Richard." "Then let's do it," I said. But before he could answer, a loud bang echoed through the station. The front door. My stomach twisted. They had found us. Lucas grabbed his gun, motioning for us to move. "Back exit. Now." Liam grabbed the bag, and we ran. The sound of footsteps filled the hallway behind us, voices shouting orders. We burst through the back door into the alley, only to stop dead. Richard stood there, flanked by 2 armed men. His face was calm, almost amused. You really don't know when to quit, do you? I clenched my fists. Neither did Caleb. His smile faded. And look where that got him. Liam moved before I could stop him, pulling his gun. But he wasn't fast enough. One of Richard's men raised his weapon and fired. The shot rang out. Liam gasped, stumbling backward. Blood spread across his shirt. I screamed. Lucas fired back, hitting one of the men in the chest. Mason appeared out of nowhere, taking down the second man with his knife. Richard turned to run, but I lunged, grabbing the gun from Liam's shaking hands. My finger tightened on the trigger. Richard froze. His hands lifted slightly. Careful, Natalie. You're not a killer. I shook with rage. My mind screamed for justice. For Caleb. For Liam. But my hands trembled. Mason stepped beside me. He's not worth it. Tears burned my eyes, but I lowered the gun. No, he's not. Lucas grabbed Richard, slamming him against the wall, cuffing him. The sirens in the distance grew louder. It was over. I fell to my knees beside Liam. His breath was shallow, his skin pale. Stay with me, I whispered. He gave me a weak smile. Guess I owed Caleb one. The paramedics arrived moments later. I watched as they lifted Liam onto the stretcher, my heart in my throat. The next few hours were a blur. Richard was arrested. His operation exposed. The truth about Caleb finally came to light. Days later, I stood outside my childhood home, staring at the ruins. Eleanor approached, her expression soft. Are you staying? I exhaled. No, but I'm not running anymore either. The past would always be a part of me. But for the first time, it didn't control me. I had faced it. I had fought back. And I had won.